Good evening. Good evening. I'm so glad to see all of you here today, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2018 Henry Louis Gates Jr. Annual Lecture. My name is Jacqueline Goldsby. I'm a professor of English and African American Studies, and I'm also chair of African American Studies here at Yale. As many of you know, but for those of you who are attending this event for the first time, the Gates Lecture marks the capstone of African American Studies academic year, partly because the event literally, as you know, if you're a student or a faculty member here, this day closes out our year of public programming. And on that point, I want to thank all of you for spending your time on this last day of classes to attend tonight's talk. And I think you'll be glad that you did. But more importantly, the Gates Lecture is particular and a special occasion for our department because these talks give us a chance to think incisively about the largest issues and decisive developments that shape the field of African American and Black diaspora studies. For the past 6 years, the Gates Lecture has brought such world-renowned scholars as the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, the dramatist, poet, critic, and Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, the legal theorist Patricia Williams, Black feminist theorist and literary critic Hortense Spillers, sociologist Dorothy Roberts, and our distinguished lecturer today, David Scott, whom my colleague Kobina Mercer will introduce shortly. All of these scholars come to share their newest, original work with us, and we're thrilled and honored to have this opportunity to think with them here in our community. This series also allows us to open this discussion as broadly as possible to include colleagues and students across Yale's campus and from the New Haven community and colleagues in the region. In this spirit of research, writing, and teaching as fellowship, as community building, we honor the example of the scholar after whom the series is named, Henry Louis Gates Jr., whose pioneering literary criticism, theory, and archival recovery projects have been, like our lecturer's scholarship, foundational for African American and Black diaspora studies, and indeed liberal arts inquiry as such. So on behalf of the department, I'm thrilled to welcome you today to join our work. To organize an event like this requires a communal effort, and I want to give thanks to the Yale staff, colleagues, and units that have made today possible. In African American Studies, I want to thank Lisa Monroe, Jasmine Williams, and Edith Rotkoff, who've done so much to build up the kind of organizational infrastructure to make this year's lecture happen and every year happen. I want to give them a round of applause. I also want to thank our colleagues here at the Whitney Humanities Center, Director Gary Tomlinson and his staff, and particularly Tony Sudol, who orchestrates so much of the AV here. Every year, they graciously collaborate with us to host the lecture in this interdisciplinary space, and I want to thank Gary and his staff for that hospitality. Speaking of space and fellowship, I just want to remind you all that following Professor Scott's lecture, we'll host a reception in room 108, which is just down the hall, and we welcome everyone to continue the conversation that I know Professor Scott's talk will generate over really nice food and drinks, so you're welcome to join us then. Finally, we owe a very tremendous special thanks to Daniel and Joanna Rose, who created the endowment funds for the Gates Lecture Series. Mr. Rose, as he is every year, is here with us today, and I want to acknowledge you for your support. And it's important to acknowledge just how much the Roses do for Yale and the work of African American Studies. Indeed, their support for this lecture series reflects their long-held commitments to education. Mr. and Mrs. Rose support a remarkable range of projects here at Yale, among them Yale Library's Fortunoff Holocaust Survivors Video Archive, Rose Walk, which is the library plaza space that was once High Street, and Urban Studies. In the place the Roses call home, New York City, Mr. Rose founded and is chairman emeritus of the highly acclaimed Harlem Educational Activities Fund, which provides educational and scholarship support to place Black and Latino students in leading colleges and universities across the United States. He's also a prolific essayist in his own right. He publishes regularly about race, labor, and economics in education in the Harlem Times, a newspaper he founded and publishes in print and online. And again, he comes here every year, and he studies the work of the speakers that we invite, and he asks some of the most incisive questions at dinner, as all of us who know you now know. So thank you again for your support. And now to introduce this year's Gates Lecturer, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Hovana Mercer, Professor of African American Studies and the History of Art.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, David Scott, who is Professor and Chair of Anthropology at Columbia University, where he's been based since 1999. So David Scott is a leading figure in post-colonial criticism, as his scholarship has tackled cultural, political, and philosophical questions of global concern through a critical lens that has redefined the Caribbean, Anglophone, Francophone, Spanish-speaking, and more besides, as a uniquely intersectional space. Through his books, his articles, and journal work over the last 20 years, Scott's intellectual commitments have sharpened the relevance of Caribbean studies to African American studies, American studies, anthropology, diaspora studies, and the humanities as a whole. So his central project is one that asks the following question: how do the humanities today contribute to rewriting the history of the present? Whether we call it genealogy, archaeology, or the world historical conjuncture, this is really the driving concern at the heart of his work. It's a question that Scott first posed in his 1994 book, Refashioning Futures, Criticism After Postcoloniality, by reframing the post, not as marking the end of the colonial era, but demanding new ways to seize hold of futurity. In the face of intransigent global injustices, he's asking, how did we get to where we are today? So as to then ask, how do we get out? What strategies enable us to move towards a usable future? Conscripts of Modernity was published in 2004, and it tackled this question by rereading C.L.R. James's magisterial narrative of the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins, in an entirely fresh light. Whereas anti-colonialists saw freedom struggle as a story of overcoming and redemption, Scott argued that our need to reconceptualize the past requires a shift from the narrative arc of romance to that of tragedy. What comes into view as a result of this shift is that black freedom struggles since the Haitian Revolution have been inescapably affected by the hazards of contingency, the ups and downs of history, and have also faced new forms of racialized domination that we cannot account for when the plot structure of romance determines our expectations of resolution and closure. So this and other works have had immense impact on historiography, on political philosophy, and really on the ethics of liberal arts inquiry at large. And those two books were followed in 2014 by Omens of Adversity, in which Scott offered what he called the theory of Haiti. This is a finely nuanced account of both the centrality of slavery to the material history of the modern West and its absenting from collective memory, resulting in the common sense that we've inherited today, in which moral dilemmas are still not yet addressed, far less overcome. And in fact, visitors to Documenta 14, which is the survey of global contemporary art that last year exhibited the actual Code Noir documents of 1685. Those visitors would have heard Scott distill his argument in a panel discussion in which he argued that the social death entailed by slavery continues as we have ongoing and irreparable consequences with demands for justice that have not yet been met. And then standing behind all of this is Scott's role in initiating the Small Axe Journal, of which he's the editor. Since its beginnings in 1997, when it came out of the Mona campus of University of West Indies, where Scott studied for his first degree and later taught before moving to Columbia, this flagship journal has redefined the field of Caribbean studies as a whole. Small Axe has played a leading role in both nurturing rising generations of scholars, artists, and performers from the region and its multiple diasporas, and, which is fully in keeping with the commitment to the post-colonial as a rewriting of the modern past, the journal has also become an indispensable archival resource. It's featured Scott's probing interviews with successive generations of West Indian thinkers, from Sylvia Wynter and Orlando Patterson to Merle Collins, George Lamming, Rex Nettleford, and Stuart Hall. So Small Axe has thoroughly reshaped neighbouring fields of study over the past 2 decades, which puts it in line with Savaku, the 1960s journal of the Caribbean artist movement, and indeed Présence Africaine in the 1950s. And for this achievement, Scott received the 2016 Distinguished Editor Award from the Council of Editors of Learned Journals. And I'd also add that what makes Small Axe uniquely distinctive is the way in which it's consistently spotlighted contemporary Caribbean visual arts. And this, in fact, includes a conference that's upcoming in Miami next month. So Professor Scott has been a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, a visiting professor at the Sorbonne, and he's lectured worldwide in London, in Beirut, and in Cape Town, amongst other places. And in fact, his most recent book, Stuart Hall's Voice, which was published last year, stemmed from those lectures in South Africa. So while we're familiar with the way that Hall is situated in relation to the British New Left and in the context of his dialogues with Western Marxism, Scott, in his book of last year, has expanded the interpretive framework so that we can think about Hall's contribution to late 20th century thought by resituating him between the radical black tradition, as Cedric Robinson called it, and, perhaps more unexpectedly, in the tradition of political philosophy articulated by Hannah Arendt and her unflinching engagement with the moral dimension of a public intellectual life. So when we consider that many of Hall's essays began life in spoken form, what's especially striking about the format in which Scott pens his own dialogue with Hall in the form of a series of letters is the importance of the aural realm of listening and attentiveness. It's in this sonic medium that Scott theorizes what he calls an ethics of receptive generosity, as the book's subtitle has it. And it's from this position that he puts forward a dialogical model of ethics that furthers our understanding of the critical mode of inquiry that Hall represented. So Scott is currently working on a biography of Stuart Hall. This is a project authorized by the Stuart Hall Foundation. And as this work informs the topic that he'll be speaking to this evening, it would be fair to say there's been great anticipation surrounding this lecture. So we're extremely fortunate in African American Studies to have Professor Scott as our speaker this evening, and he's graciously agreed to take questions. There are microphones on either side of the auditorium. And as I reiterate Jackie's invitation for you to join us in the reception afterwards, I ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor David Scott to Yale.
Thank you very, very much for that introduction, Kabina. It is a very, very great pleasure to be here this afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking Jackie for the invitation and for doing me the honor of speaking here. I am deeply appreciative of the generosity of Mr. Daniel Rose, who has made the lecture series possible. I would also like to thank, before I begin, Gary Tomlinson, the director of the Whitney Humanities Center, for hosting the lecture. And of course, I am too very appreciative of Henry Louis Gates, in whose name the lectures are offered. A Sense of Displacement, Stuart Hall's Art of Living. What follows are emphatically notes, nothing more. There are going to be 4 of them. They will, I think, be connected more or less to each other, but they may not exactly add up to an overall coherent thesis. Not yet, anyway. Certainly they do not constitute a systematic argument. Rather, and in the spirit of Stuart Hall's own characteristic way of formulating what he had to say, they are meant to be tentative and provisional and exploratory, really only points for further elaboration and clarification. They are, so to speak, notes toward a long avant-propos to the biography of Stuart Hall that I am in the middle of thinking and writing. And yet, nevertheless, these notes are not meant to be entirely aimless. They seek in their own way to circle around the general theme of what I'm going to call Stuart Hall's art of living. His distinctive self-constitution of a reflective, thinking, acting life, a self-examining life. His ingeniously paradoxical project of self-creation, of being becoming who, in part, he already was. Self-creation and self-consciousness were, in him, sides of a single whole. A good deal of what is simply remarkable about Stuart Hall as an intellectual is already suggested here, namely the profound sense in which his thinking came to bear the stamp of his life, and vice versa, his life the stamp of his thinking. What he professed and how he lived came to have an intimate bearing on one another. Now, in recent years, there has emerged an instructive discussion of a distinction between philosophy, thought of as an academic discipline, and philosophy understood as a way of life. In part, at least, and not so surprisingly, this discussion has emerged in response to, and in conversation with, Michel Foucault's late preoccupations with a contrast, as always heuristic, experimental, penciled in, between what he thought of as 2 branches of Western philosophy. One historically rooted through the Delphic prescription to know thyself, and the other through the Socratic notion of the care of the self. In a certain sense, the former is the branch that eventually comes to be institutionalized as the theoretical discipline of academic philosophy, characterized by a selective, specialized training and authorization, an impersonal attitude of formal detachment for the sake of objectivity, and a systematic and methodological search for the truth. By contrast, the latter orientation, associated more perhaps with literary or therapeutic or even spiritual endeavors, has been concerned as much with the moral personality of the thinker as with the characteristic features of their thought. Foucault sometimes called this an aesthetic of existence. In a now well-known description to which indeed Foucault was indebted, the historian of the ancient world, Pierre Hadot, suggested that what was entailed in this orientation, articulated variously but connectedly by the Stoics and the Epicureans, was not just a specific type of moral conduct, though this too was important, but a mode of existing in the world, one that had to be practiced attentively and continuously, and whose aim was not purely mental, but involved the transformation of the whole of the individual's life. By the same token, the goal of this orientation was not truth, or not exactly, not as understood by rival academic philosophers. Rather, the goal was a quality of attunement, better thought of as wisdom. Philosophy as a way of life was directed toward the cultivation of wisdom, even while recognizing the impossibility of its ultimate realization, and real wisdom was taken to be less a matter of the right application of theorems or technical jargon than the striving involved in becoming different than one already is. I'm not going to belabor this distinction between philosophy as an abstract academic discipline and philosophy as an art of living any more than I need to. I will, in any case, return to it briefly at the end when I reflect on one dimension of how Stuart Hall practiced an attunement to finding and changing himself. But I hope you can already discern why it might be useful here in setting in motion my reflections on Hall's intellectual mode of being. Arguably, many of those we think of as shaping something like a black radical tradition valued philosophy less as an academic discipline than as an art of living. Certainly, Hall eschewed the title philosophy as the covering name for his particular brand of thinking, the grandiosity, the conceit, not to say the Eurocentricity of the whole philosophical posture. For him, the academy was merely one kind of pedagogical occasion, one aspect of which was the institutionalization of epistemological routine. It was by no means the guarantee of the authenticity or authority of thinking. In any case, thinkers such as Hall, who practice an art of living, or thinkers whose thinking forms a constitutive dimension of a reflective form of life, think variously of Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, W.B. Du Bois, Erna Brodber, have no real need for authenticating or authorizing labels. Their thinking is not easily separable from their lives. What they think and how cannot be cleanly disentangled from who they are, from their personal and moral identities. And therefore their thinking is inseparable from their individuality and from their style. If Stuart Hall seemed always to live within shouting distance, as he might have said, of a range of affiliations and solidarities and commitments, multiple ways of being with various others, he was, nevertheless, an unmistakably singular individual, inimitable, his own unrepeatable voice and presence. I think of this singular individuality as involving intimations of an ethical passion, and I think of the pivot of this passion, its animating ethos, as having been his vivid sense of displacement, of ever being at odds, of never quite corresponding to a completely settled composite of himself. There is a lot to say about the way Hall practiced an art of living as displacement or through displacement, in particular how it gave point and inflection to his style, how it seasoned the soul of his disposition, how it salted the restlessness of his spirit, how it conditioned his reflective consciousness. And I will try to say some of it here. My whole point, though, to give it to you at the outset and all at one go, will be to suggest that although displacement would become, so to speak, his hermeneutic handle, the covering name for a conceptual family of technical or theoretical preoccupations, including, for example, his special uses of the ideas of identity and diaspora, it was more than that. It was the name for a primary form of experience, the name, in other words, of a habitus. He knew it before he could spell it, to use a locution he was fond of. He embodied it before he had a theoretical language with which to articulate it. Here, in any case, are the 4 notes. Note 1. Not surprisingly, as I think about his biography, one of my central questions is how to understand Stuart Hall in relation to Jamaica. By this I mean, how to think the senses in which Jamaica, that is, his formative experience of the geopolitical Jamaica between 1932, when he was born, and 1951, when he left for Oxford, thus the cultural historical Jamaica he, in some relevant sense, embodied, helped to shape the distinctive intellectual he eventually became. In what sense should Jamaica matter to telling the story of Stuart Hall? Or again, how might we generatively connect Hall to a Jamaican specificity? How might thinking with and through Jamaica help us to understand something about the intellectual who came to be committed to an art of living? I don't think these are straightforward or easily answered questions. It is true that my recently published book, Stuart Hall's Voice, was not expressly concerned with a biographical direction of inquiry. There, for better or worse, the questions that concerned me, namely Stuart Hall's responsive voice as the resonant dimension of a dialogical ethics of receptive generosity, of a practice of giving that was also an openness to receiving, were framed by an exploratory consideration of intellectual friendship, of what we owe to those whose work we admire and honor. I might now say, in retrospect, that since friendship is precisely a dimension of an art of living, I am still working within the wider penumbra of these considerations. However, the question, how to understand Hall in relation to Jamaica, is directly relevant to how I now want to think biographically about the relation between his life and his work, or his work as in part at least an expressive embodiment of the art of his life. Moreover, as some of you might know, the sense in which he might be thought of as Jamaican wasn't unimportant to Stuart Hall himself, or anyway, complicated and intangible as it was, it seemed to become more and more important to him, especially in his later, more retiring years, perhaps in part as growing old, altered the temporal frame in which the present could be connected to the experience of a past and to the expectation of a future. Age, as we know, is a perverse perspective modifier. One is reminded of that luminous moment in Derek Walcott's Another Life, when the poet laments that, quote, "A man lives half of life, the second half is memory," unquote. Walcott, of course, was obsessive about the writerly implications of growing old. But still, there is something there in what he says about the way, as the future seems to contract as a time of active possibility, the remembered past looms larger and larger, and not necessarily as a transparent time of easily reconstructed effect-producing causes, but almost certainly as a hermeneutic opacity, or at least a repeating puzzle. As the prospect of new beginnings recede, so the question of the past's relation to the present grows in force and consequence. I think that, in some measure, over the years, over the years, the question of his relation to Jamaica expanded, swelled in Hall's imagination. Reflecting on his reluctant decision to participate in a conference held in his honor in Jamaica in 2004, he remarked that while he had spent a great deal of time thinking about dilemmas other than those concerning Caribbean people, it seemed to him, nevertheless, that he had always been doing so, quote, through the prism of his Caribbean formation, unquote. What could he possibly mean? Famously, Hall resisted autobiography. He resisted telling the authoritative story of himself, how he became Stuart Hall, how Stuart Hall became him. Memoir wasn't intuitively his métier. He was an essayist by inclination and temperament, but having resisted autobiography for so long, he oddly found himself in the middle of one. One, moreover, that he couldn't quite finish and yet couldn't quite let go of. I've talked about this before and won't repeat it here, the paradox of writing in the last conjuncture, the ways in which the memoir was an uncannily difficult writing form for him, inasmuch as it demanded a certain relation to time, and especially to finitude, and therefore a temporal relation to the self that couldn't quite be settled once and for all through a memorial retrospective panoptic, seeing it all at the end of a day that would not yield to another. The memoir form is a consummate time stopper. It preempts futurity, and Hall thrived precisely on the possibility in the present of the future displacing the past. But there remained and remains the persisting question, who anyway was Stuart Hall? And how had this Stuart Hall come to occupy so central a place in the intellectual history of the 20th century? Why did so many people from so many different domains of intellectual and artistic life, from different generations and ethnicities, converge on or depart from Stuart Hall? It wasn't self-evident, not least to Stuart Hall himself, what meaning to attach to this. There seemed, not surprisingly, a haunting element of overdetermination at play here, something that evaded easy identification or clarification. More than this, it made for an ironic, unsettling form of subject-object experience. As Hall suggested himself on more than one occasion, it was as though he would, from time to time, turn a corner and, unexpectedly, find himself fleetingly face to face with the figure of someone called Stuart Hall that people were talking about. Occasionally I recognize him, he wrote. I sort of know him. He has a sort of familiarity now and again. But this experience of, as it were, experiencing oneself from the outside as an other sort of person next door is uncanny. It is like being exposed to a serialized set of embarrassments, unquote. This figurative Stuart Hall that existed beyond him, that was never securely within his control, seemed to require some biographical explanation, or anyway, some narrative location. From a certain point in his career, as we know, he was forever recounting for others chapters of the story of himself in Britain. Those chapters especially that had to do, for example, with the historic making of the first New Left, or with cultural studies, or with the conjuncture of Thatcherism. But Hall also perceived a deeper, more complicated story to be told, a story that involved an enigma of departure as much as an enigma of arrival, a story of the place he left behind, yet carried with him, a story, that is to say, of Jamaica. In short, Hall found that he too had to reconstruct the story of Stuart Hall from the beginning, so to speak. And this is the story he tells in characteristically oblique and mediated fashion in Familiar Stranger, the first installment of his memoir. As with everything he wrote, this reconstruction became really more an exploration, a way less of writing autobiography, strictly speaking, as a comprehensive account, than as a process of clarifying, first of all, to himself, the constituent elements of the long journey he had made to who he had become. The memoir became a way of learning, and also of learning how to learn something about himself, something perhaps he already knew in some inchoate embryonic form, but could now encounter from another point of view. And part of what he discovered recovered, to use a couplet he especially liked about himself, I believe, and tried to articulate, was that his life had a resonant shape that belonged not merely to himself, but to the modern world that is the colonial story of Jamaica. Or to put it slightly differently, what he recovered, was that the colonial Jamaica from which he came was not an incidental dimension of the universal history of modernity, but precisely an exemplifying index of it. And therefore, who he was, say, as a colonial, was an embodiment of one of the forms in which the ethos of modern life made and expressed itself. Note 2. As I say, Stuart Hall was a singular intellectual. He inhabited the world in his own way, with an unmistakable presence. What we miss when we miss him is that his presence, erudite, inclusive, even-tempered, generous. What made him distinctive as an intellectual, I believe, and this is my argument in Stuart Hall's voice, is less the substantive content of the subject matter of his thought than the content of the form of his ever unfinished thinking. As everybody knows, Hall was an intellectual of wide and multiple preoccupations. He staked a voracious claim in many debates, from Marxism to media studies to popular culture to the visual arts. And in each of these debates, what he added to them or how he changed them has become an indispensable aspect of his legacy and our inheritance. But Stuart Hall was more than the sum total of his separate or interconnected contributions to the intellectual history of our time. He was much more than the sum total of his many ideas. Who he was as an intellectual exceeded the specific and the celebrated views on Thatcher, say, or on the end of the essential black subject. Indeed, these views are what they are because of who he was, not the other way around. In other words, he was who he was as an intellectual by dint of his style. By style, though, I do not mean something merely decorative or ornamental like a mannerism or a flourish, something external and thus detachable from something else taken to be the central core of his work. Rather, I mean what I take George Lamming to have meant when he wrote of Edgar Mittelholzer that, quote, "Nothing matters more than a man's discovery of his style, a discovery which is also part of his own creation. And style, not a style, but style as the aura and essence, the recognized example of being in which and out of which a man's life assumes its shape, the flavor of his thinking, the furious silences that fill his heart, and finally his function, the work that chooses him and for which there is no alternative, no other instruments he can select to fulfill that choice. These constitute the style of a man," unquote. Style is the soul of an art of living. For Hall, I believe, style defined the content of the form of his thinking, acting, being. It was not a merely contingent aspect of that thinking, acting, being. It was constitutive of it. What characterized Stuart Hall was a certain sensibility, a certain attunement, a certain texture of understanding, by which I mean a certain way of coming at the world, the gestalt of an existential attitude that was the style of his habitus. And if we had to give a name, a covering name to this style and this attitude, it would be a sense of displacement. Here, perhaps, is the center of what I want to get at this afternoon. Fundamental to Stuart Hall's experience of himself in the world was his sense of displacement. This is a word that he used constantly in talking about himself. It is all over the text of Familiar Stranger. Hall lived in and through displacement in all its ramifying resonances and implications, including, importantly, the psychic ones. He was fully aware, for example, of psychoanalysis as one of the provenances of displacement as a technical term, one that Freud used to talk about dream work in particular, the way the unconscious lives in the world through substitutions, condensations, postponements, and other decentering mediations. Displacement was what you might call an experience-near concept for him. In any case, a good deal of Hall's moral psychological sensibility can be thought of in terms of this, to him, founding sense of himself as being, in the phrase he liked to borrow from Edward Said, out of place. It captured almost everything about him. Hall understood himself to be constitutively and forever out of place. And much of his genius consists of the way in which he learned to use this sense of displacement, of not quite corresponding to a presumed norm of self and society, as a kind of hermeneutic lens through which to approach and critique the world. Displacement became, in effect, the model for his very idea of thinking. For Hall, thinking worth the name depended on non-identity, on the non-identity of the subject and object in an intimate way. It was for him the discrepancy, the difference, the non-correspondence between the Stuart Hall, for example, of his own experience, and the figured Stuart Hall that would become, he said, a possibility for his own thinking. And I quote again, "There is a sense in which one has to stand back outside of oneself in order to make the detour through thought, to approach what one is trying to think about indirectly, obliquely, in another way, another mode. I think that the world is fundamentally resistant to thought. I do not think it wants to be understood. So inevitably, thinking is hard work, a kind of labor. It is not something that simply flows naturally from inside oneself," unquote. Notice that the world, including ourselves as part of that world, is not readily thinkable, readily discursible. The world, including ourselves as part of that world, is not merely transparent appearance. Notice then how thinking for Hall was not a self-evident activity, but a mediated labor of creative displacement, and how his own experience of himself could become the ground of his hermeneutic understanding. He didn't know this automatically. It wasn't a self-evident fact given like a gift to him by the world. It was a fact, he suggests, he had to earn by learning it and relearning it. And one way of expressing what he learned to do is to say that he learned to think through the unnamed Jamaican in himself, and to think through it in such a way as to render that experience of Jamaica a tacit form of universality. In other words, what he learned gradually to do was to make the experience of displacement that was, as George Lamming might have said, native to his person, the implicit and explicit basis of his relation to theoretical understanding as such. He did this, of course, not so much by writing substantively or extensively about Jamaica, which he didn't do, but by writing out of the social historical fissures and moral psychological textures that provided the unconscious background of his fundamental experience of himself. Note 3. So how might we usefully think of the sources of this ground of displacement? Again, working in relation to the question of biography, I believe that Hall's familial and social origins in the Jamaican brown middle class are a founding location for the emergence of this experience of displacement, at least in latent form. Hall's parents, Herman and Jessie Hall, belonged to a distinct fragment of this class. I won't go into the wide-ranging sociological details here. Suffice it to say that the elder Halls, seem to have embodied the familiar ethos and values of the brown middle class: self-consciousness, obsessive self-consciousness of color and class and social advancement, a preoccupation with respectability and propriety, decorum, the cultivation of good taste, manners, and so on, and to have produced for the young Stuart at their apparently meticulously organized and well-appointed home on Trevanion Park Road in 1930s and 1940s Kingston, the subtle and not so subtle appurtenances of brown middle-class life. It is in this context that, in a pre-theoretical way, he comes to embody displacement as a kind of primary experience, that displacement comes to acquire the quality of second nature that informed a given tendency of dispositions, a habitus, and that would become the implicit background resource for his later more self-consciously reflective or theoretical ideas. Because again, note that in my view, for Hall, displacement was first and foremost not a theory, but a sense of the world, a sensing of the world, less the way he self-consciously came to the world than the founding way in which the world came to him in the elementary form of intelligibility. Now, as some of you probably know, the Jamaican brown middle class is a peculiar social, psychological, and historical formation. It is a formation, I believe, that we have not thought about sufficiently in either fictive or non-fictive work. Still, in my view anyway, given its singularly contradictory and fundamental role in the making of modern Jamaica, it is a social formation that deserves far more critical attention than it has so far attracted. Among several possible directions, for example, there is surely a psychoanalytic story waiting to be written about the internal libidinal structuring of this social formation, the way historically it has lived its sense of distinction, and the way these touch on the most intimate and minute aspects of its social, personal, and emotional existence. The defining social and affective experience of this middle class, what Ian Hacking would call its historical ontology, is precisely displacement, that is, its unsettled, tormented inability to be what it is, to find a restful home in a given identity. Indeed, one might say, and not irrelevantly, given Stuart Hall's later preoccupations, it is partly the fact of displacement that stimulated in this formation its anxious and frustrated obsessions with the very idea of its national identity. But what is it about this middle class that encourages an originary experience of displacement? How might we think of this founding sense of displacement as coming to form the ground of a larger way of being in and thinking through the world? Speaking in an excessively shorthand and perhaps even somewhat reductive way, it is important to bear in mind that the Jamaican brown middle class was historically born within and out of the social contradictions and sexual violations and depredations of colonial plantation slavery. In a certain very relevant sense, it was born already out of place, anomalous, and excrescence within a social economic order principally organized around a black-white, enslaved, free racial binary. In this racial dynamic, the brown middle class belonged to neither one pole nor the other. It lived rather in a structurally indissoluble ambivalence. In one direction, in disavowal of any proximity with blackness, including the blackness within itself. In another direction, in aspiration of material and symbolic identification with whiteness. In a profound social, cultural, and psychological sense, neither this disavowal nor this aspiration was completely realized, completely realizable. And therefore, what defines the brown middle class is the way it has lived perpetually, unevenly, in an unresolvable tension or anxiety of belonging. As Hall later recognized, born as he was in 1932, he grew up inside this brown middle-class formation as it negotiated a period of unprecedented upheaval marked by the modernizing social and political revolution of 1938 to 1944. That is, the period between the labor riots and the reforms that initiated constitutional decolonization. For this was a conjuncture, in Hall's sense, in which the spontaneous revolt of the black urban and rural working class in effect pried open a political space that enabled the aspiring nationalist brown middle class to, at last, begin to mobilize a successful claim for its right to rule. In this sense, constitutional decolonization was a project of middle class hegemony. But if this was a moment of tremendous possibility for politically progressive sections of the nationalist middle class, seeing before itself the luminous prospect of getting its hands on the reins of government, it was also a moment of threat and loss for another section, one numerically smaller perhaps, but not insignificant, that could only see the coming future of nation-state sovereignty as the looming ruin of the old colonial Jamaica. Although we sometimes think of it this way as a consequence, no doubt, of the retrospective normalization of the nationalist narrative, historically, the brown middle class was never a homogeneous formation. Certainly, in the 1940s, when Stuart grew up, they were not all committed nationalists, or not uniformly so, not unambiguously so. It shouldn't be surprising, therefore, that whereas there were those who came to see themselves in the mirror of nationalism, there were also those who looked to the future with a mixture, perhaps, of fear and resignation. Among these were Stuart Hall's parents, Herman and Jessie. He always said they were not like our imagined norm of the nationalist brown middle class, and this is what he meant. They never warmed to the ideology of national self-determination. It's not clear they welcomed the democratizing adult suffrage constitution of 1944 that brought the black working class into the formal field of politics. Undoubtedly, for their fragment of the middle class, their disavowals and aspirations must only have been intensified by their increasing anachronism, their growing social and political irrelevance. In this context, one can only imagine how the rituals of brown middle-class pretension and repression, the unreal realities of life at Trevanion Park Road, must have registered in a contradictory way on the young Stuart Hall. I say contradictory here because the paradox, as he would have been the first to point out, is that you had necessarily to be it in order to be able to organically recoil from it, as he did. You have to already embody the class color habitus into which you have been installed in some form in order to live its pretensions and repressions in an equally embodied dissenting refusal. That is, not merely as ideology, but as a foundational decentering of moral psychological identity inscribed in the primary experience of a divided self. For self-division, in a word, is the distinctive mark of the Jamaican brown middle class. Hall's self-consciousness of his journey, indeed his self-consciousness of himself as a kind of itinerary, is the story of constantly navigating the trace, as he would say, of that original structure. He was always preoccupied with the way in which an outside, quote unquote, comes to be lived on or as an inside. That is to say, the way large social historical processes are transmuted into lived experiences within a family, say, or how a social and political economy comes to be installed psychically in an individual's libidinal economy. As with everything he talked about, this relation between an inside and an outside was never perceived in a reductive way. The psyche, for example, was never a mere reflection of the social. Rather, what compelled him, as one version of the relation between the general and the particular, or the social and the individual, or the historical and the psychological, was the contradictory, perhaps partly phantasmatic way a family comes to embody, in a mediated or decentered or displaced way, the social contradictions of a particular history. Or further, how a child comes to embody, again in a mediated or decentered or displaced way, in the domain and language of the unconscious, the layered burdens of both the social and the familial. It is this experience of the brown middle class's alienation from itself, I believe, not merely its anti-popular or elitist character or cultural politics, but its moral psychological betrayal of something of itself, its destructive racial self-hatred that founds Hall's constitutional sense of non-correspondence and therefore of displacement. Again, my point, almost my whole point, is that part of what makes him the singular intellectual he became was to have been able to transmute this pre-theoretical habitus into a hermeneutic by which to conceptually understand the world. In other words, in my view, it is not so much the content of the theory of identity or diaspora, say, that bears consideration, as the sensibility that draws him to them as conceptual windows, the attunement to the texture of a modern racialized colonial experience that solicits from him the demand for a theory of them. It is this, to my mind, that makes Stuart Hall so distinctive and intellectual. Note 4. Finally, I want to talk a bit about Hall in relation to the ethical life that I believe was implicit in his practice of an intellectual art of living. By ethical life, I do not mean anything very abstract or abstruse, anything excessively Hegelian, say, let alone Levinasian, though both have their relevance. I mean simply to evoke a vital background dimension to Hall's way of carrying on his self-examined intellectual life, the temper and orientation of the values and virtues through which that life, as a life that cultivated human excellences, was actualized. I keep saying that what interests me about Hall is not the content of his views so much as his way of having views, and indeed his way of changing his views. This is what I'm calling his style, and that style connoted and disclosed an ethics, an idiom of unformalized attitudes that shaped his presence as much as his practice. I will try to connect this ethics to my exploratory description of his experience of being a Jamaican. As I have been saying, a particular primary experience of displacement lent to Hall some of the basic elements out of which he developed his mature cultural political style and vocabulary, and also, therefore, the tacit idiom of his ethics. Or to put it another way, and in the form of a question, how might one describe the sort of reflective consciousness disclosed in Stuart Hall's work? It is obvious, I think, that Hall's was a profoundly reflective consciousness, that is, a consciousness that lived in a perpetually self-questioning way. But I do not think that it is enough to merely say that he was self-questioning in his mode of intellectual practice, because there are, obviously, many ways of being reflectively self-conscious. One way I have been trying to describe Hall's distinctive mode of reflective being, his self-conscious way of being the intellectual he sought to be, is by thinking of him as a listening self. It's an idea I borrow from the work of Michael Levin. I've developed this idea at length in my book, Stuart Hall's Voice, in particular the contrast between a critical and a listening self, the former shaped in various ways by a hermeneutics of suspicion, and the latter, again in various ways, by a hermeneutics of attunement. It is easy to see how one might, however imperfectly, map this contrast onto the one I sketched earlier, between a philosophy thought of as a theoretical discourse and philosophy understood as a way of life. A hermeneutics of receptivity is exactly what the wisdoms of a way of life entail. But I'm not going to return exactly to the idea of a listening self here. Rather, I want to focus on another, though connected dimension of Hall's ethical mode of intellectual life, one concerned with his capacity for self-constitution and self-revision. You will recall that in Pierre Hadot's formulation mentioned earlier, this capacity for self-engagement is precisely one of the characteristics of an informed art of living. And here, irony might be a useful dimension to consider. So in an admittedly exploratory way, I want to layer the idea of a listening self with that of an ironic one. Might one say of Stuart Hall that his was an ironic life? Now, I want it to be clear that I'm not using ironic here in the conventional sense to suggest something merely linguistic, namely saying one thing while meaning another. Rather, I'm using it in much the way it has been used by some recent thinkers, among them Richard Bernstein, Jonathan Lear, Alexander Nehamas, to suggest less a figure of speech than a form of experience and an orientation to life. On this view, an ironist is not a metaphysician, but a practitioner of an art of living, one specifically that cultivates a readiness for disruption and revision, or if you like, of displacement. An ironic self is one that experiences itself as never quite corresponding with itself. It is a self that lives with an acute sense of its own historicity. An ironic self is attuned not only to the world as change, but to itself as potentially changeful. It acknowledges the uses of stepping back, if not all the way to nowhere. It practices not an abstract detachment from the world or from itself, but on the contrary, a passionate commitment to receptively relating to both. I think it won't be hard to recognize dimensions of Stuart Hall's art of living in this brief description. Let me give you just one example of what I'm getting at. The example is a familiar one that Hall himself talked about in various of his writings, though of course not exactly in this way. It concerns the antinomies of his own constitution and self-constitution of identity, and it is profoundly marked by the ineliminable imprint or trace of Jamaica. Remember that when, accompanied by his implacable mother, Jessie, Hall arrived in England in 1951 to take up his roads, he was, by his own account, a bright young man with a sound grammar school education, an emerging, if still inchoate, political consciousness, and above all, a longing for the modern. This arrival in England coincidentally converged with the arrival of thousands of West Indian migrants, large numbers of them Jamaican. It was the beginnings of the so-called Windrush generation that would alter the landscape of contemporary Britain. And some of you might be aware of the incredible scandal around this generation as it ages and requires medical attention and so forth in contemporary Britain. These were men and women who were decidedly not by the prevailing norms like Hall in class or color or education, but they were people with whom he began, uncertainly, to form, partly conscious, partly not, an identification, and post Notting Hill in 1958, a sense of solidarity. Now, as he tells it, on one of his trips back to Jamaica in the early 1960s, his mother says to him that she hopes the English don't mistake him for an immigrant. That is, one of those black working-class West Indians he'd seen chaotically streaming out of Paddington train station. It is for Hall a radical or rupturing moment of self-deconstitution and self-reconstitution. To this point, his identity has principally been as a participant in the project of the New Left, then in transition, but he instantly recognizes in his mother's tendentious remark the perverse machinations of brown middle-class racism, the neurotic disavowals through which she was seeking to distance him from the abject stain of blackness and to reinstall him into the hegemonic place of his social origins. And not only does he recoil from the unavoidable negative psychological impact, but in the same moment he finds in it the positive reflective ground for renaming his sense of displacement and animating it, moreover, with specific cultural political content. Yes, he says to himself, I too am an immigrant. And indeed, as the immigrant emerges in the middle and late 1960s as a politicized category, especially in the context of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood ideology, Hall finds himself speaking before such audiences as the National Committee for Commonwealth Immigrants. But almost as soon as this moment of decentering has acquired a usable vocabulary and a plausible affective salience by the end of the 1960s, almost as soon as he has gotten the hang, so to speak, of being an immigrant, he's once again unexpectedly decentered, thrown off balance by a new set of social and existential forces. For while he was being an immigrant, a new generation was emerging, including his own children, largely born in Britain, who were influenced by the militancy of Rastafari and reggae and black power, and who saw themselves not in the demeanor of the supplicant colored immigrant, but as black, with an assertive claim to make on the British state and the civic institutions of British society. A new cultural political language was emerging. It was emerging in a slightly different way in Jamaica too, in exactly the same moment. And it is for Hall another rupturing moment of self-deconstitution and self-reconstitution, another intimate moment of uncanny and ironic disruption, when he is faced with the unstable historicity of who he is, when he can no longer simply go on occupying the old identity. Immigrant, he too is black, he discovers, recovers. And he must now confront the implication for himself, both personal and political, of getting the hang of being black, of discovering the idiom of a black identity, of thinking and acting in the name of a black subjectivity. Being black wasn't exactly natural to him, he says, but it wasn't exactly not. He didn't grow up that way, in that language. He had to grow into it. He had to learn to be what, in part, he already was. Identity might well be constructed, but it isn't, he said, merely a journey of the mind. Now, the point I'm making in recounting this example, its specific content notwithstanding, is less that Stuart Hall eventually grew to think of himself as black, or even that, as a way of theorizing the process, he invented the famous idea of the end of innocence of the essential black subject, both important in themselves, of course. Rather, my whole point, my larger point, and this is where I will end, is that what we see here is an instance of the ethics of Stuart Hall's art of living in displacement. It is an instance of his capacity in shifting conjunctures to self-consciously take stock of himself, the courage to open himself to the experiences of an upheaval of identity in himself, and to be able to respond receptively and creatively and personally to the demands embodied in the attendant rupture. I do not say that it was a seamlessly perfect endeavor, without inconsistency or contradiction. I do not suggest that there weren't limits to his receptivity to changefulness, that there weren't modes of living and idioms of individuality and sociality, beyond his capacities for attunement. He was human, after all. But nevertheless, I believe we have in this example an instance of the kind of reflective consciousness that he sought to educate in himself and encourage in others as a way of, he would say, living with difference. The differences within oneself and between oneself and others. And I'd say that learning to live with difference is another way of learning to live with irony, learning to live with a sensibility that registers responsiveness to the idea that human being is never transparent, never a simple, seamlessly self-evident totality, but lived in of multiply mediated iterations of division and self-division, lived in short, in displacement and non-correspondence. These to all were integral aspects of our human forms of life. And what I'm saying is that his sense of displacement and non-correspondence grew partly out of his own primary experience of them, out of the prism, he might have said, of the idiom of his Jamaican formation. Thank you. I see you taking a deep breath. So the one requirement is that you be gentle.
Well, it was wonderful. It was beautifully written and wonderful in many, many ways.
But.
And I guess, and I got a great sense of the kind of art of living of David Scott and the kind of conversation and reciprocity. But it seemed, I guess the difference, and the way I can ask the question, is it missed to me in Stuart Hall's work and writing that it was more about the care of others than the care of the self. This is a man who I don't think ever did publish a book with only his own name on it. That almost all the work, even the memoir that we get, Familiar Strangers, is the publisher's recreation of it as a memoir. The original version was as an interview series. And the model I think that he was even thinking of, he wrote a wonderful review of the series of 400 pages of interviews that the New Left Review editors did with Raymond Williams. And he reflected on the power of interview rather than memoir, if I remember. It's not been recent. And so I guess I wonder about the accenting of the self, even as it is divided self, and how much your attention to the content of his form actually is in tension with the form of his content. The rhetoric of human, in many ways, the deep refusal of humanism and the varieties of that, his interest that, the line, though he would move from one particular theorist to another, it does seem that his interest from Althusser on to Foucault to others was in many ways an attempt to displace that foundational, that sense of founding fundamental humanity and self for some kind of alternative way of understanding community, even an intellectual community. So I don't know whether that's exactly a question.
Thank you very much for that, though. I'm not sure where exactly to begin. I think we're not very far from each other. I don't think of. Let me begin back from where you end, Stuart, as an anti-humanist. I don't think so at all. I don't think so at all. I think, okay. I don't think so at all. and part of what I mean by that, I think, is that there is something crucial for him, especially in structuralist iterations of himself, in which a kind of anti-humanist theoretical posture was important for the ways in which he sought to intervene and displace various kinds of assumptions, normalized selves of various sorts, and so on. So I think there is a really important way in which a theorist's posture of anti-humanism characterized a good deal of his, separating himself from the kinds of humanisms represented by Raymond Williams or E.P. Thompson, and on and on. So I think yes, but I think that was also salted in some way by a humanity that I think is embodied in what I elsewhere call his receptive generosity, which you point to at the very beginning of what you have to say, the sense that his orientation was always an orientation to the reflective consciousnesses and the preoccupations of others. But to me, that receptivity of others was partly a way of informing himself and part of the way in which he changed himself. So, I think that there is an attunement, absolutely, an orientation to a worldliness and to others and various kinds of others who constitute that world. But I think there was an attention to what was required of change in himself that sought to meet the contingencies in which he found himself. So I think an attentiveness to the world of change in others was but one side of a preoccupation with the question, what do I need to change in myself? And I think that's part of, Stuart would never talk about himself in the terms that I have used here, obviously. And so there is no theory, there's no ethical theory, properly speaking, in his work. I am digging it out in some form and trying to look at some of the other sides of it by which to refract some of the things we, in some sense, many of us already know in that attention to others, to difference. Gentleness is, of course, all that's required.
Well, thank you. I had two questions. One was a footnote, a sociological one, so it may not be about, I was thinking about what you mean by the brown middle class, and part of that is thinking about anti-colonial nationalism and hegemony, and of course, as you know more than I do, from inside the Subaltern Studies Project, that narrative is considered unfulfilled, but it's also a polarization between an elite and a subaltern mass. Mm-hmm. And so I was curious in this maybe technical or sociological sense, in what sense is the brown middle class and not elite? And is that in some sense about the kind of values of propriety or Victorian conduct that you emphasize as being the middle classness of that? And the other question I thought of when you describe displacement as being native in some sense and pre-theoretical to Stuart Hall, it also seemed to be a very spatial category, or a structure, well, a Freudian, in the Freudians is a very structural category, and then obviously as a metaphor for migration, departure and arrival, it has a very spatial sense. But I was thinking as a parallel to your work on tragedy, and especially in Conscripts, where you're very interested in temporal disjuncture or out-of-timeness. So I was just trying to think of, so it seemed that Stuart Hall has an out-of-placeness, but he doesn't seem to have an out-of-timeness, or I guess that's the question, and that, in another way, that his orientation towards the future or contingency, and it just seems an interesting question because in a way Marxism, and again the Indian parallel, Indian Marxism struggles with a lot of temporal baggage around around what the philosophy of history is. But Stuart Hall, at least in his writing, never seemed either nostalgic or temporally, is that a word, disjunctured, in the way that the spatial does seem to mark something. So that's the question.
The sociological question. The brown middle class in the Caribbean, but perhaps more specifically here, Jamaican social formation, becomes an elite. It certainly is a nationalist elite. But in the context of Jamaican historical social formation, the elite are white. And the elite are rabidly anti-nationalist. And the colonial project is in some way, and they are the holders of, up to the 1930s, of social, economic, and political power. The brown middle class, in the 18th and early 19th century, these are the free-coloreds. These are folk who emerge as people of distinctiveness largely through the professions because they can't own land, because they're prohibited from owning land, largely, and prohibited from voting. And it's an interesting formation because by the 19th century, they begin very explicitly to think of themselves as the only Jamaicans, that the black majority come from an elsewhere and the white minority come from their own elsewhere, but they have, this is theirs, this is the only thing that they have. And by the early 20th century, they are installed as the leading thinkers of what the nation project might be that they will inherit. Does that answer? Does that partly? Yeah. So it's middle class in almost a quite literal sense that they are middle, and in some sense never really become an economic elite. They can't transition to economic ownership, which is part of the conflict around race in contemporary Jamaica. That there's arisen a black middle class that has displaced the brown middle class voice. Yeah, but the second question about temporality, Stuart Hall's out of placeness, but not his out of timeness. You know, I'm not sure exactly how to respond to there is a certain timeliness. This was Terry Eagleton's very unfortunate London Review of Books essay about the hippest, and therefore, in fact, an attempt to pay attention, as he thought of it, to the sense of timeliness of Stuart Hall's interventions, that he had a way, in my view at least, Eagleton constructs this in a pejorative way, but his attention to a certain, to the now in some form, the attention to the politics of theoretical intervention. And in that sense, he was constantly asking the question about what time is it? And he would always joke, I think, often with Catherine, his wife, who's an historian, that is your problem, not mine. The past is yours, the present is mine in some form. And I think that there is something important about not that history didn't matter, but it mattered only insofar as you could get something from it that would enable not an epistemological critique, but the kind of political critique that would open space for some new kind of political action. And I think that in a very curious way, that sense of his own timeliness, that sense of his own temporal orientation to the not yet of a future to come, made writing a memoir very, very difficult. It made it enormously difficult for him to stand away from his own time and to see his entire past up to his present without the possibility, as he sat in his house, of a real future to come. For him as an actor, an anomalous kind of temporal situation for his own selfhood. So I think that there is I don't think that he was without a sense of the baggage of the past. I don't think so. I think he carried, I think that in a certain sense, and this is partly what I meant by growing old, that as he began to reflect more and more on how he became who he was, or who he was taken to be, or who he understood himself to be, that understanding as he grew older was shaped less and less by the possibility of new intervention, and more by the expansiveness of a past that he carried, and a past that was not entirely straightforwardly nameable to him, especially the Jamaican past, because his cultural theoretical language was a language that had grown up inside of and in relation to the struggles around the New Left and afterwards. Now is the time for a drink. Thank you all very much.